God still speaks to us through the words of the Scriptures. Thanks be to God. This is the third week that we've been given a lengthy scripture passage telling of an important interaction that Jesus has with someone. 2 weeks ago we read of Nicodemus, a Pharisee, who comes to Jesus at night, hiding from others but seeking to understand Jesus' message about being born again, or born from above. The passage does not tell us about how he leaves Jesus, but we assume that he leaves almost as confused as how he arrived. And yet Nicodemus is affected by his meeting with Jesus. We hear of him 2 more times in John. Once when he objects and asks for due process for Jesus. And lastly, when he meets with Joseph of Arimathea to collect Jesus' body and prepare it for burial. Last week we read of the Samaritan woman. Coming to the well at high noon to avoid the other women, she is amazed to meet this Jewish man, Jesus, who talks to her and asks her for a drink of water. They talk about her life and about the arguments that Jews and Samaritans have over places of worship. He offers her living water. She leaves her bucket behind to go and tell others about him. And her belief that he is the Messiah causes others to go to him, invite him to stay, and eventually to their claim of their own belief in him. Today we're given another very lengthy passage where Jesus interacts with a man born blind. Like the Samaritan woman, the man is nameless, which gives us a clue to his importance in his community. His disability means that he is a beggar, and that people walk by him every day, perhaps without seeing him. The disciples do see him, but only as a curiosity, evidence of someone's sin. I'm always a bit nervous when we encounter disability in the Bible. I worry that it will perpetuate stereotypes of people with disabilities. That they are less than non-disabled people, that they are only deserving of pity, that their role is to receive healing and to be grateful. Which is why I'm often surprised by Jesus, as he doesn't always behave the way that I expect. For example, in the Synoptic Gospels, we hear of this paralyzed man lowered down through a roof on a mat by his friends. When he is placed in front of Jesus, Jesus looks at him and forgives him of his sins. He doesn't offer physical healing. It is only when others complain that he has no authority to forgive sins that he performs a physical healing to make a point. And then in Mark 10, we hear this story of another blind person, Bartimaeus, who hears that Jesus is passing by and shouts at him, asking for mercy. Jesus' attention is sought and received. And Jesus turns to him and says, "What do you want me to do for you?" Now maybe he was just trying to get Bartimaeus to take responsibility for what he was asking for, but I think it's equally possible that Jesus was really asking. He doesn't see disability and assume it needs healing. Jesus also doesn't see disability and assume it is a punishment for sin. The disciples do, because it is a cultural assumption. It sounds so outdated to think about disability as a punishment of sorts, but there are many places, even in our modern world, where this thinking persists. That somehow people are to blame for their illnesses or their conditions. The person with diabetes must have had an unhealthy diet. The autistic child, like my own, must have been vaccine injured. The cancer patient was too stressed or too heavy or not positive enough. These ideas persist because it gives us some kind of comfort to think that we have some control over our lives and over our world. If we are terrified of cancer, it can comfort us to think that we can avoid it by taking lots of walks and eating a clean diet, whatever that means. If we are frightened of the COVID-19 coronavirus, it can be comforting to think that those who have caught it so far were to blame by not being careful enough. But the trouble with this thinking, beyond it just not being true most of the time, after all, my own father died at 65 of cancer after spending the last 10 years training for 10K runs and training other people. The real trouble with this thinking is that it shifts our way of seeing, our lens on life, from connection to disconnection. Our self-defensive fears cause us to distance ourselves from others, to deprive ourselves of learning from others, of loving and being loved. Jesus hears the cultural assumptions of his disciples and replies quickly, "Nope, that's not it. It's no one's sins that cause blindness." The New Revised Standard Version has him say, "He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him." I don't prefer that version because it sounds like yet another explanation. I like Eugene Peterson's message. In the message it says, "There is no such cause-effect here. Look instead for what God can do." And that's what he says. Let's get to work, says Jesus. Let's reveal God's love in the world while we can. And then he cures the man's blindness. The rest of the passage, the majority of the passage, is about other people's responses to the healing. How others struggle to come to grips with what's happened. People who probably walked by the man on the street 1,000 times now aren't sure they recognize him. Is that him? Or is it just someone who looks like him? And the Pharisees and the temple leadership want to know all the details. Just how did this happen? And who did it? And by what authority? They interrogate the healed man, and then his parents, and then him again, looking for a loophole. They don't want Jesus to be the hero of this story, to be the prophet, as the healed man calls him, as the healer appointed by God. To them, he is the rule breaker, the one who doesn't respect the Sabbath or their authority. It can't be the way the man says. But the healed man speaks his truth. He calls it like he sees it. "I don't know all about rules and definitions," he says. "All I know is that once I was blind, and now I see." And so they kick him out of the synagogue. His healing means that he loses his place of worship, his faith community, possibly his family and friends. The final paragraph of the passage, Jesus hears what has happened and returns to the man. "Do you believe in?" he says, meaning, do you know? Do you trust in the Son of Man? Because that's me. The healed man says, "I believe," and he worships him. In contrast, the final words of the Pharisees are these: "Surely we are not blind, are we?" How will we respond, especially in these days of uncertainty and fear? Will we look for people to blame, like the disciples? Will we focus on controlling what's allowed and what's not, like the temple leadership? Or will we seek to share in God's work while we still can, as Jesus asks? Trust in him and follow in his footsteps. Seek the healing and well-being of others and share God's love with them. I have seen you do all these things already, and trust that that will continue. Even in times of pandemic, even as we are isolated physically, let us continue to live out the abundant life of God's reign, reaching out with love and compassion, revealing the light of Christ that is within us. May it be so. for you and for me. Amen.